New York, America, 1863. Patrick McGinnis has been drafted and must report to the nearest Union Army barracks. Your commander, Captain Jenkins, yells to the angry mob outside the draft office. Immediately, a woman's voice screams out, "You won't take my husband!" Others take up the cry, "We're not dying for the slaves! Let the rich fight their own war!" Ever since the draft lottery for the Union Army began in New York, the crowds have been getting larger and angrier. You have been spat on, kicked and punched on your way to work, and that's just by the women. "Pipe down with you! Pipe down!" Jenkins calls to the mob, looking increasingly harassed. A rock smashes through the window and barely misses your head. Captain Jenkins strides up to the open door and roars, "That's it, you Catholic scum! You're lucky to be here and not starving to death in some hovel in Ireland. You'll fight for this country and be glad of it." The mob howls back its rage. You turn the selection wheel again and pull out another name. But when you see who it is, your blood freezes in your veins. "Sir, Captain, that's the head of the Black Joke Fire Brigade. They're basically a street gang, and have been riling up the crowd all afternoon. If we call out his name, there will be a riot." Jenkins just dismissively waves his hand at you and strolls to the door, shouting out, "Peter Masterson has been drafted and must report to the nearest Union Army barracks," a hint of a smirk on his lips. For a second, nothing happens. Then someone laughs, and a gunshot rings out. Stones shatter the windows as the mob tears in. Their faces are contorted with rage. Jenkins on the floor, being beaten black and blue by 5 firemen. He screams for help, but you have your own problems. "Down with the draft! Down with the blacks! Down with Lincoln!" they yell as they smash up the office and overturn the draft lottery box. You escape through the back door and run down the street for help. As you turn around, you can see clouds of black smoke and flashes of flame as the draft office turns into a roaring inferno. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. What was the worst riot in American history? Watts in 1965? Detroit in 1967? The LA riots in 1992 after the Rodney King beating? Well, these were nothing compared to the mackdaddy of them all, the New York City draft riots. The Big Apple in 1863 was a vast pressure cooker just waiting to blow, riven by racial and class tensions, combined with disillusionment towards the Civil War raging outside. When Abraham Lincoln introduced a draft to fill the depleted ranks of the Union Army, violence exploded on an almost unimaginable scale. As the city descended into bloody chaos, it would take the same US Army regiments that had just been victorious at Gettysburg to retake the streets. In 1863, America as a whole was at a low ebb. Civil war gripped the nation. For decades, America had been divided over slavery. The industrializing North and the agricultural slave plantations South increasingly viewed each other as rival societies, locked in a struggle for America's future. As the bonds between North and South snapped one by one, Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 convinced many Southerners that their way of life was under threat, and state after state left the Union. When Southern forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, civil war followed. By 1863, the Civil War was entering its third bloody year, and the Union faced a problem. Hundreds of thousands had volunteered to fight, but after 2 years of slaughter, the flow of recruits was drying up. The casualty lists from battles such as Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville seemed endless. Yet the war showed no signs of ending. The Union Army desperately needed more troops, but to get them, they were going to have to force men into uniform. Lincoln's administration began to contemplate a draft. If adopted, they knew it would be controversial across the North with the war-weary public, and nowhere was the prospect of conscription more explosive than New York City. The Big Apple was a very different place from the megacity we know today. New York had not yet been consolidated into the famous 5 boroughs of the modern city. It was only Manhattan Island. Brooklyn was an independent city in its own right, while Staten Island, Queens, and the Bronx were mostly made up of small towns and rural farming communities. Restricted to just Manhattan, the city was overcrowded and bursting at the seams as a huge wave of mass migration transformed its demographics. The Irish famine and the 1848 revolutions in Europe caused a huge wave of immigration to America, with many settling in New York. The city's population shot up to over 800,000, with 400,000 of these first-generation immigrants, over half of them Irish. It's fair to say life was very hard for these new arrivals. 58% of New York's population, mostly migrants, were confined into 15 downtown wards that covered less than 9% of Manhattan's area. Conditions were truly awful. Families were packed into windowless tenement blocks, squashed so closely together that you could barely breathe, and privacy was non-existent. In the Lower East Side, population density soared to a staggering 240,000 people per square mile. It was a claustrophobic, exotic, dirty, and dangerous world. Irish brogue, Yiddish, English, and various German dialects could be heard on every street corner. The different communities working the same menial jobs, drinking in the same dark taverns, and mingling in the same dance halls. Death was a constant companion, as cholera and tuberculosis ran rampant thanks to a lack of proper ventilation, clean water, or sewers. Death rates in the overcrowded tenement districts were triple those of the city overall. Life was cheap in this world. Ethnic hatred often ran deep, and overcrowded tenements were constantly on the edge of massive explosions of violence. Between 1834 and 1863, there were at least a dozen major riots. The film Gangs of New York does a good job of recreating this world, but take into account it is the sanitized Hollywood version. In real life, it was far worse. All the recent immigrants had their struggles. The Jews faced anti-Semitism, the Germans couldn't speak English, but both the Germans and the Jews often brought skills with them from the old world to the new, ranging from tailoring to brewing beer. The Irish, on the other hand, were mostly poor farmers. They struggled in a rapidly industrializing New York. 70% of them by 1860 were working in low-paying, unskilled jobs, the last to be hired and the first to be fired, despised by the Protestant establishment for their Catholic faith. Clinging to a precarious existence, the only advantage they had was their white skin. They were automatically further up the racial totem pole of American society than African Americans, if only just in some eyes. On the flip side, they were terrified that if the slaves were freed, they would swamp New York, undercut their already pitiful wages, and take their jobs, a fear eagerly exploited by Democratic politicians and street agitators. In several major riots of the period, Irish working-class mobs carried out horrific violence against black New Yorkers that wouldn't have been out of place in the worst parts of the Deep South. Inevitably, some spotted an opportunity in the overpacked tenements filled with desperate immigrants. If they became citizens, they could vote. The Republicans made little headway with the Irish, nor did they really try. There was a strong anti-immigrant and abolitionist tinge to the party, not calculated to win Irish hearts and minds. The Democrats, on the other hand, had no such issues. The Democratic Party of the 1860s was very different from the organisation we know today. They were the party of the South and were strongly aligned with the planter aristocracy. They won the loyalty of the Irish through the soon-to-be infamous Tammany Hall. This was a political machine that helped the poor migrants with small favours such as gifts of food and finding them jobs, in return for loyally voting for Democratic candidates. To make sure they could vote, Tammany ran a huge campaign to sign up as many as possible as citizens, an act that would have big consequences in the future. Now they were citizens. They could be drafted to fight. New York was always a city on the edge of violence. Riots were hardly unknown, but it took the coming of the Civil War to supercharge the grievances of the city's struggling masses. When the war came, New York wasn't the liberal bastion we know today. It was strongly linked to the slave-owning South thanks to the cotton trade. Cotton fueled early industrialization. Until 1860, that was America's primary export. Thanks to the southern plantations, it was the Saudi Arabia of the 19th century cotton trade, and New York was at its centre. Cotton flowed through its port on the way to the factories of Great Britain and New England. It was the heart of the action for cotton brokers and provided the financing and insurance plantation owners were always desperate for. Manhattan took 40 cents of every dollar from southern cotton sold overseas. The prosperity of the whole city relied on King cotton. Not for nothing did Southerners joke that New York was the true capital of the South. When the South succeeded, there was a lot of sympathy for them in New York, especially when the working classes and those involved with the cotton trade. On January the 7th, 1861, Mayor Fernando Wood, a Democrat, called on the city's Board of Aldermen to, quote, "declare the city's independence from Albany and Washington," end quote. He wanted an independent New York as a free city, still able to trade with its southern partners. The idea was even gaining traction, until the fighting started. While New York provided tens of thousands of soldiers for the Union and much of its financing, those southern sympathies never went away. Many still muttered that the city's prosperity was being sacrificed for the slaves. As the war raged on, pro-war Republicans and anti-war Democrats battled for power in the Union's most important city. The Republicans controlled New York State, but the city was in the hands of Mayor Wood and his cronies. They were part of the Copperhead faction of the Democrats, so called for both the copper badges they wore and the venomous viper of the same name, who wanted peace at any cost, opposed emancipation of the slaves, and often veered close to treason. The power structure of the city was divided. Previously, the elites had clamped down riots as quickly as possible, but not this time. Now, there were influential figures at the highest levels of New York who would be quite happy to let the violence rage on. The struggle between these factions also shaped the force that would be on the front lines of any riot, the New York Police Department. It had only been formed in 1853 and had quickly fallen under the control of Mayor Wood, who turned it into his personal goon squad. In retaliation, the Republican-controlled state government created a second police force free of Wood's influence in 1857. The city now had two police forces with a distinct ethnic divide. Wood's municipals were mostly Irish Catholic immigrants, and the metropolitans were primarily Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The results were like the Keystone Cops and NYPD Blues. Quote, "Chaos ensued. Criminals had a high old time. Arrested by one force, they were rescued by the other. Rival cops tussled over possession of station houses." End quote. Eventually, in 1860, the two forces were merged together under new Superintendent John A. Kennedy. But the city's police force remained deeply politicized. By the eve of the riots, many Irish immigrants didn't view the police as protectors, but as hostile agents of the Republican establishment. The police were completely unprepared for the fury coming their way. They had no dedicated riot unit as we would understand it today, just regular officers armed with wooden truncheons, instructed to disperse crowds by force. The tinder had been laid. New York was divided over the Civil War, especially among its elites. A vast, alienated and seething underclass was ready for violence, and the police were deeply unpopular, highly political, and unprepared. It would take just a spark. The Lincoln administration had tried to avoid a draft, but by March 1863, they could delay no longer. The Union had taken heavy casualties. The flow of volunteers was reduced to a trickle, and desertions were worryingly high. To make matters even worse, 130 regiments were coming to the end of their enlistments and were scheduled to leave for home in May and June. The Union Army needed 300,000 new soldiers in all. Congress passed the Enrollment Act. All male citizens between 20 and 45 became eligible for military service. It was particularly controversial for three main reasons. The first was this draft would be run by the federal government, not by the states, as had been the previous practice. Many began muttering about overreach by the Lincoln administration, and that the act itself was unconstitutional. Secondly, recent immigrants who had declared their intention to become citizens had 60 days to leave the country or become eligible to be drafted. Thirdly, and most damaging, was a provision allowing a draftee to escape service by providing a substitute or paying a $300 commutation fee. To put it in context, a New York labourer might make no more than $6 a week. $300 was a small fortune. The administration defended the use of substitutes and exemptions as necessary to keep skilled men in business and industry, ensuring the war effort continued to function effectively. Understandably, this did nothing to quell the fury of those not rich enough to pay $300. Back in New York, news of the draft fell on a particularly sullen public. Life was getting harder, and for people already barely surviving, fear stalked the streets. Inflation behind the Union lines was running at 70 to 80%. Everything from food to rent to basic services was getting more expensive. Wages for poor labourers in New York failed to keep pace, leaving many unable to meet the rising cost of living. Meanwhile, the bankers, the industrialists and the merchants grew fat on government contracts. Class tensions were always bad in New York, but now they had an extra layer of bitterness. One labourer complained in a letter to the New York Times, quote, $300 has made us nobodies, vagabonds and outcasts of society. We are the poor rabble, and the rich rabble is our enemy by this law. End quote. It was a long, hot summer in 1863. The packed tenements became stifling ovens, driving residents out into the streets in search of relief. The city reeked of rubbish and human waste, with little rain to wash the filth from the gutters. The smell lingered in the sweltering air. As the relentless sun beat down, tempers began to fray. On street corners and crowded saloons, speakers played on growing fears about the draft, warning working-class New Yorkers that they would be the ones sent to fight and die. New York was hot, crowded, and angry. It would not take much to set it ablaze. The growing resentment was captured by Manton Marble, editor of the New York World. He wrote, quote, "Our people have become sick of useless butchery and dread, strengthening a government that is strong only with the weak and unarmed, and nerveless of the battlefield, where alone it shows its power." End quote. The Provost Marshal announced a date for New York's draft lottery: Saturday, July the 11th. The city would have to provide 26,000 troops. As news of the lottery swept through the city, another crisis was unfolding. 20,000 state militiamen marched out of New York and headed for Pennsylvania. Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had invaded the North for a second time, and those soldiers would soon fight at Gettysburg. Their service would help secure a crucial victory for the Union, but their departure left New York dangerously exposed. Only about 550 troops remained in the city. In previous disturbances, the state militia had restored order. Now, the police would largely be on their own. The first day of the draft was surprisingly quiet. 1,200 names were drawn from a cylindrical drum, sarcastically dubbed the Wheel of Misfortune by onlookers. But the draft authorities then made a big mistake. The next lottery would be on Monday. The city had a whole day off work to drink whiskey and pore over those 1,200 names, mostly working-class men, a large number of them Irish immigrants. By 4 a.m. on Monday the 13th of July, groups were already streaming out of the tenements towards the draft office. The crowd's mood was peaceful at first. Many just wanted to protest the draft. But as they swept through the streets, the saloons emptied, and workers downed tools and joined the growing procession. The sun beat down, the temperature rose, and much whiskey was drunk. The mood of the mob began to get ugly. The draft officials didn't respond well to the menacing atmosphere, trading insults with the protesters, as we saw in the opening dramatization. Tempers were beginning to fray. Riding up the crowd were the black joke firemen. Fire brigades in New York were voluntary, neighborhood affairs. They're often little better than street gangs. Previously, they had been exempt from being conscripted in New York State. However, this exemption wasn't carried over for the federal draft. The black jokes were furious, causing much of the trouble outside the draft office. When the name of the black jokes leader was announced, tensions that had been building all morning finally boiled over. The crowd exploded. With the black jokes in the lead, they hurled paving stones through the windows, shattering the glass, and smashed their way into the draft office. Rioters beat the officials nearly to death, and then set the building ablaze, turning it into a raging inferno. A small detachment of troops tried to put down the riot quickly. They fired a round into the crowd that killed or wounded half a dozen rioters. But the mob descended on them, howling with rage, and clubbed 2 of the soldiers to death. A third was thrown off a ledge into the East River. As he struggled to swim, they dropped large boulders on him. The draft riots had begun. All hell broke loose as the rioters discovered there was no one to stop them. The first target of the angry mobs were the police. Rioters targeted the homes of officers or those sheltering them. Captured policemen were stripped of their uniforms and beaten, if not killed. In one particularly gruesome instance, a woman attempted to cut off the ear of a badly beaten officer, but squeamish rioters prevented her from finishing the job. Doctors were later able to reattach his ear. Superintendent Kennedy unwisely set off on his own to see how bad the riot really was. He rode in a buggy until he hit blockaded roads and proceeded on foot. As he walked up Lexington Avenue, a former cop recognized him and yelled, quote, "Here he comes! Kennedy! Let's finish him!" End quote. The crowd pounced on Kennedy and savagely beat him until he was almost unrecognizable. Physicians later counted more than 70 knife wounds on his body alone. 70! The only reason he survived was that a friend convinced the mob he was already dead. It's amazing that he wasn't. With Kennedy out of action, it was all up to his replacement, Thomas Acton, President of the Police Commission. Police headquarters on Mulberry Street stinks of sweat and fear. The building is as quiet as the grave, save for the staccato clatter of the telegraph. Its operator is a terrified young officer, barely out of boyhood, reading out the grim news. Looting and casualties at 47th Street and 3rd Avenue. Fires spreading rapidly. With Kennedy fighting for his life, responsibility for saving New York has fallen to you. "How many men do we have, Sergeant?" The grizzled sergeant replies, "Just 800, sir. The rest are out of the city." The telegraph clatters again. "Rioters have overrun a military arsenal, now armed with rifles." 800? God help us. Recall every available officer. Port under attack. Warehouses being looted. A black man has been lynched and burned. We've asked for help from the army, but they're not responding. Most are in Pennsylvania anyway. A large mob is heading our way, announces the operator. But suddenly, the staccato beat stops. The operator looks up fearfully. They must have cut the telegraph wires, sir. You look out the window. Flames are springing up across the city. Turning back to the room, you bellow. Then we stand alone, every available man into the streets. Hold the city, whatever the cost. Acton was spry and athletic for his age, the proud odour of fine silver mutton chops, and as tough as old nails. For the next 5 days he would barely sleep, rarely leaving police headquarters, except to lead his men into the streets as the city burned around him. Inside, reports piled up. Outside, the mob had the run of New York. As the police battled the mob attacking their headquarters, other rioters struck elsewhere across the city. Allerton's Hotel at 43rd Street and Lexington Avenue was set ablaze, the fire spreading rapidly and engulfing the nearby American Telegraph Company office. At 21st Street and 2nd Avenue, the violence escalated. Rioters stormed the armory, overwhelming its defenders and seizing weapons from within. When police arrived to retake the building, they met fierce resistance, and in the chaos, the armory was set on fire. Flames tore through the building as the two sides battled in the smoke-filled streets. As the violence spread, attention turned to a new target, New York's small black community. Years of demagogues and Democratic-aligned newspapers, stoking fears of free blacks competing for white men's jobs, had created a poisonous hatred. Now, it erupted into horrific brutality. William Jones, a free black man, was walking to buy bread when he was attacked by rioters. He was lynched in the street as the mob howled its approval, and his body was later burned near St. John's Church. At the docks, small numbers of African Americans had been employed as longshoremen, outraging the predominantly Irish dockers. They now took their revenge. White business owners who employed free blacks were stripped and savagely beaten, while boarding houses that rented space to them were burned to the ground. Soon, owners were forcing out their black tenants, desperately trying to save their properties. These poor men and their families were left to the tender mercy of the mob. At best, they were beaten within an inch of their lives. At worst, at least one was lynched. His body hung from a lamppost and burned. The mob's violence was becoming increasingly focused on black New Yorkers and the institutions that served them. The worst was still to come. A large drunken crowd began marching towards the coloured orphan asylum on 43rd Street and 5th Avenue. It had nothing to do with the draft or politics. It simply cared for 237 black orphans. Yet for the mob, anything linked to African Americans must be destroyed. Like a hypnotic chant, they yelled out, "Burn the black nest." Police evacuated the terrified children, who fled into the streets, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Paving stones were thrown at them as the mob screamed, "Vermin! Vermin!" The rioters then took out their rage on the empty orphanage. Men smashed everything in sight, while women and children looted food and furniture. When they were done with the carnage, they set the building on fire and cheered as the searing flames consumed it. One man dared to try and stop the attack, shouting out, quote, "If there is a man among you with a heart within him, come and help these poor children." He was beaten so badly that he barely survived. Proud of their handiwork, the emboldened mob set off to attack the home of New York Mayor George Opdyke on 5th Avenue. There had been a political change just before the riots. The Republicans now controlled the mayorship of the city, but the Democrats were now in charge of the state. After hearing about the destruction of the orphanage, Acton decided he couldn't wait for the army. He was going to take the fight to the rioters. Inspector Daniel Carter, with a hastily assembled force of 125 policemen, volunteered to lead the assault. He vowed, quote, "I'll go and I'll win this fight, or Daniel Carpenter will never come back alive." End quote. Acton clapped him on the shoulder and replied, quote, "Make no arrests." End quote. Rushing uptown in their paddy wagons, they were soon face to face with the mob on Broadway. As you stand in 4 rows with your fellow policemen, you stare grimly ahead at the huge crowd of rioters pouring down the street. There are thousands of them, armed with clubs, pitchforks, iron bars and pistols, while at the front a man carries the stars and stripes with "No Draft" emblazoned across it. They fill the entire street, overturning carriages and smashing windows, chanting out at a steady beat, "Kill the Republicans, kill the blacks, kill the rich, and kill the police." They're getting closer and closer, jeering at your tiny force and yelling out insults. There are so many of them. A bearded man with a scar running down his face steps forward, clutching a crowbar. You vaguely recognize him as a local thug, and he seems to be the mob's unofficial leader. He glares at Carpenter and mockingly shouts, "Is that all Lincoln could send you, boyo? Run away, and we might let you live." Carpenter doesn't flinch. For a moment the two sides stand facing one another in silence. Then he raises his truncheon and bellows, "Up, guards, at them!" He charges forward at the leader, barely dodging the crowbar that swings at him, before bringing down his truncheon with a satisfying crack on the thug's head. The mob's leader keels over dead, and you wade into his followers, swinging your truncheon. It's a tough fight. A pistol fires, and you feel the heat of the bullet on your cheek as it barely misses your head. A sword pierces your left hand, but still you club anything in sight, bodies beginning to pile up around you as the fighting rages on. Finally, the mob breaks and begins fleeing down the side streets to escape. This really happened. Those 125 policemen held the line against 10,000 rioters. As they advanced, another squad of police hit the mob in the rear, causing them to flee. It was a decisive defeat. The riot would now be contained in central Manhattan and wouldn't spread to the rest of the city. But the police's work wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. In the afternoon, a huge crowd of rioters descended on the headquarters of 2 Republican and draft-supporting newspapers. They first targeted the New York Times. Henry Raymond, one of the paper's co-founders, secured 3 Gatling guns from the army and mounted them in the windows. There was just one problem. They had no ammunition. It was all a bluff. Luckily, the rioters took one look at the fearsome guns, already invented a year earlier, and decided to attack the New York Tribune instead. Its editor was Horace Greeley, a prominent anti-slavery campaigner, and the mob hated him with a burning passion. They surrounded the building, gathering supplies of paving stones and guns in preparation for the final assault. In the words of one of those trapped inside, the mob was, quote, "surging in black waves all around the building, creating a vision of total depravity, shouting, hooting and yelling." End quote. The Tribune staffers were trapped, and so to fortify their headquarters, smuggling in rifles and using bales of printing paper to blockade doors and windows. As the rioters waited for darkness to fall, many went to the nearby Bull's Head Hotel and demanded free drinks. When the hotel refused, they smashed its windows with rocks, looted its alcohol stocks, and then burned the Bull's Head to the ground. As the clock struck 11 p.m, the Tribune staff members began to unpack the crates of rifles, only to discover that the wrong ammunition had been provided. They were completely defenseless as 300 rioters with flaming torches marched towards the building. They chanted over and over again, "We'll hang old Greeley to a sour apple tree. We'll hang old Greeley to a sour apple tree and send him straight to hell." Greeley was begged by his staff to flee out the back door, but the eccentric publisher refused. Instead, he marched out of the front entrance. By all rights, that should have been the end of him. But there was one small problem for the mob. They had no idea what Horace Greeley actually looked like. As he strode down the street in his shabby clothes, they dismissed him as a doddery old man of no interest. Greeley made it to the safety of his favourite restaurant. The Tribune staff had a lucky escape as well. Just as the mob was about to reach them, Carpenter and 110 policemen appeared and set upon the rioters with their already bloodied clubs. As one witness described it, quote, "Those of the 300 who were not on the ground dead or helpless were soon fleeing wildly in all directions." End quote. The failed attack on the Tribune ended the day's rioting, especially as the heavens opened up and torrential rain doused the fires that had been burning. It was only the first day of the riot, and so far there had been lynchings on the streets, an orphanage had been burnt down, and Gatling guns mounted in the New York Times headquarters. There was far worse to come. While the police had finally managed to regain control of parts of Manhattan, help from the army remained conspicuously absent. The problem was the general who had been left behind to lead them, General Wool. There was a reason he wasn't sent to Gettysburg with the rest. He was 75 years old, infirm, and slightly senile. Really, he shouldn't have been on active service at all, but he had powerful patrons. As the riots raged on, Wool seemed bemused at a loss. One of his own officers complained, quote, "General Wool seemed very much confused and worn out, and I should judge unable to perform any duty." End quote. As Wool did nothing, the city burned around him. Thankfully for New York, Acton and Carpenter were made of sterner stuff. They prepared all night for the storm they knew was coming the next day, repairing telegraph wires and reorganizing their battered force. On Tuesday, July the 14th, as the sun rose, so did the temperature. It was baking hot, and even more humid than the day before, with barely any breeze. As the scorching air hung over the city like a blanket, the police telegraph wires hummed with a new message, quote, "They are coming. They are coming. Let every officer do his duty." End quote. The mobs poured out of the sweltering tenements, baying for blood and chanting, "Kill the rich, lynch Lincoln, and kill the blacks." It was a different crowd from before. Many of the volunteer fire brigades, including the Back Jokes, now tried to calm the violence, but the unrest they'd helped ignite the previous day was far beyond anyone's control. The rioters' ranks were now swollen with angry labourers, criminals, and what one contemporary called, quote, "the sweepings of the gutters," end quote. While the mobs were smaller than on Monday, they were far more violent and vicious. Pitched battles, even more furious than Monday's, raged all day. Almost 5,000 rioters invaded the Union Steamworks at 22nd Street and 2nd Avenue, where thousands of government carbines were stored. A strong force of police under Inspector George Dilks stormed the building and piled the carbines onto wagons before the mob could seize them. Women were in the midst of the fighting, hurling bricks and stones at the police, and fiercely swearing all the while. One reporter observed, quote, "The women manifested more pluck and courage than the men, resolutely standing their ground when ordered to disperse by the officers." End quote. No sooner had Inspector George Dilks driven the mob from the steamworks than another desperate message arrived. Mayor Opdyke's house was surrounded, and the crowd was calling for him to be lynched. Dilks wheeled his exhausted officers around and raced across the city. Meanwhile, the mob surged back into the steamworks. Poor Dilks and his exhausted officers had to fight their way through the building for a second time, battling room by room until the rioters finally set the place ablaze, forcing the police to abandon it. The army had at last begun to enter the fight. General Harvey Brown had just bypassed the inept wall completely. As the soldiers entered the streets to support the police, they were shocked by just how well armed and determined the rioters had become. One company fought a mob at point-blank range on Delancey Street, beat them back, only to be attacked again on Pitt Street. Elsewhere, a detachment of Marines was forced to retreat before another mob on Grand Street. As the temperature rose throughout the day, so did the violence. That badass Inspector Carpenter found himself with just 300 officers facing a mob of more than 10,000 rioters as they rampaged down 2nd Avenue. This particular mob was targeting the city's wealthy elite even more aggressively than the day before. Mansions were stormed and set ablaze, while anyone who looked well dressed in the street risked being chased down, stripped, and brutally beaten. After hours of street fighting, Carpenter's men had driven the mob back to 34th Street. But here they walked straight into a trap. Hundreds of rioters had taken to the rooftops or positioned themselves in the windows of the towering tenement buildings. A perfect ambush site. Bricks and paving stones rained down from above, while snipers picked off the officers one by one. Forced to take cover, Carpenter urgently called for military reinforcements. By this stage, it's worth noting that the riots were becoming something of a civil war within New York's Irish community. Many of the rioters were Irish, but so too were the police officers and soldiers they were fighting. The community was increasingly split between those who managed to climb a rung or two of the social ladder and those who remained trapped at the bottom. What happened next was deeply tragic and controversial. Colonel H.T. O'Brien arrived with a detachment of soldiers and 2 cannons. The plan was simple. The artillery would clear the streets, while Carpenter's officers fought their way into the buildings, driving the rioters from room to room. The cannons were loaded with blanks. However, the now battle-hardened mob refused to budge. O'Brien then ordered his men to fire warning shots over the crowd's heads. The results were catastrophic. The bullets struck people watching from the surrounding windows, killing 7 civilians, including 2 children. The mob erupted with fury, and the battle became even more desperate for Carpenter and his exhausted officers. That afternoon, O'Brien would pay a terrible price for his actions. He lived on 2nd Avenue, near to 35th Street, and foolishly went back to his neighborhood after the day's fighting. An Irishman himself, he believed that his name would protect him from retribution. It wouldn't. As he stopped at a neighborhood drugstore, a baying crowd quickly gathered outside. It's baking hot and sweat drips down your forehead in rivers, but you barely notice. Such is the tension and anticipation in the air. "Murderer! Murderer!" you scream along with hundreds of others gathered outside the neighborhood drugstore. Inside is Butcher O'Brien himself. Now is the time for vengeance. The drugstore door swings open, and he emerges from within, a sword in one hand and a gun in the other. You tighten your grip on your club as a silence suddenly falls over the crowd. Finally, O'Brien steps forward. "Let me pass. No one needs to get hurt. I'm Irish, just like you." The crowd starts howling with rage again, and a man shouts out, "Fellow Irishman, my ass! You've sold us out so you can lick the rich men's boots and give our jobs to the blacks. You're a disgrace!" Angrily, O'Brien retorts, "You're the disgrace, Maguire. You're burning your own city." The tension is razor sharp, hovering on the edge of an explosion. A woman with wild, haunted eyes suddenly steps forward and hurls a brick, screaming, "Murderer!" It sails wide, smashing through the drugstore window instead. O'Brien wheels around and fires his pistol. The woman collapses, clutching her shattered knee. For a heartbeat, the street falls silent. Then, as one, the crowd surges towards him. For 6 hours, the mob beat O'Brien with clubs and paving stones. Then they dragged his still breathing body over the rough cobblestones to his own courtyard, where for hours more men, women, and even children danced around him. Observers later recalled that he was, quote, "terribly mangled, his body almost naked and covered with gore," end quote. Finishing the job, a woman caved in his head with a paving stone. During O'Brien's agonizing ordeal, a druggist who tried to give him water was beaten and his store ransacked. A young girl who tried to stop them was also beaten, and the house where she boarded destroyed. By now, the riot was barely about the draft at all. It had become something darker. A city tearing itself apart after years of mounting grievances. As the violence raged on, the Democratic governor of New York State finally made an appearance. Horatio Seymour wasn't a copperhead, but he was highly critical of the Lincoln administration, and the draft in particular. His divided loyalties were soon on full display. On one hand, he backed declaring a state of emergency. On the other, he gave a speech that would haunt him for the rest of his political career. Quote, "Let me assure you that I am your friend, and you have been my friend. And now, I assure you, my fellow citizens, that I am here to show you a test of my friendship. I wish to inform you that I have sent my Adjutant General to Washington to confer with the authorities there and to have this draft suspended and stopped." End quote. While Seymour called them friends, the rioters were using cut-down telegraph poles, carts, wagons, lumber, boxes, bricks, and rubbish to build barricades on both the east and west sides of Manhattan. The area between First Avenue and the river, from 11th to 14th Street, had long been a stronghold for the Irish Catholic working class, a neighbourhood where Republican authority was almost non-existent. Those living here would remain the last holdouts of the riot. On the island's west side, mobs barricaded the area from 36th to 42nd Streets along 9th Avenue. This posed a far greater threat than the East Side barricade, allowing the rioters to dominate much of the Upper West Side from behind its walls. At 6 p.m., the police, reinforced by a company of federal troops, assaulted the barricade. The soldiers advanced, firing volley after volley, and drove the rioters back, while policemen dismantled the wall. 4 times the rioters rebuilt the barricade, and 4 times the soldiers blasted their way through it before it was finally destroyed. A volley from the troops routed the last of the resistance. By nightfall, an eerie silence settled on the city. Wednesday morning dawned beneath torrential rain, the heavens opening and drenching the city. Combined with news that 4,000 federal troops were on the way, the city held its breath to see if the riot would finally end. But the mob seemed determined on bloodshed, starting off the day's rioting with a horrific murder of an African American. James Costello, a black shoemaker, was chased down the street by a rioter. In self-defense, Costello shot his attacker, only for a screaming mob of 300 to descend upon him. Pulled into the middle of the street, Costello was beaten to death with fists and stones, before being hanged from a nearby tree. The mob sliced off his fingers and toes as souvenirs. Years later, these grisly mementos were being proudly shown off by those who were there. For some reason, Mayor Opdyke thought this was the perfect time to announce that the riots were over, claiming, quote, "The riot, which for 2 days has disgraced our city, has been in good measure subjected to the control of the public authorities." End quote. This was rather like Iraq's information minister Comical Ali insisting everything was under control while American tanks rolled into Baghdad. As Opdyke spoke, onlookers could literally hear gunfire echoing through the streets and smell the acrid smoke from the fires raging across the city. The mobs themselves seemed determined to prove their mayor wrong. That morning, 5,000 rioters had been driven from 7th Avenue and 32nd Street by US artillery, firing grape shot at point-blank range. But the mob collected again in greater strength at 19th Street and 1st Avenue. Colonel Cleveland Winslow, with one of the few infantry detachments available for street fighting, and Colonel Edward Jardine, with a battery of 2 howitzers, marched to meet them. As Winslow's men rushed forward, they were attacked from every window and rooftop by rifle fire and bricks. The infantry were cut to pieces. Winslow had to order an immediate retreat. Jardine, struck by a bullet in the leg, crumpled to the pavement. But for the bravery of a local resident giving him shelter, he would likely have been killed by the mob. In the early hours of Thursday morning, the rioters attacked a government warehouse on Greenwich Street, where 20,000 muskets were stored. This cache might have given them control of the city if Acton had not learned of the plan in time and sent a large force to stop them. It was almost dawn before the turning point arrived. The steady tramp of thousands of feet, the 10th and 56th Regiments, New York National Guard, was heard along the lower Broadway. At 4 a.m., the perfectly formed ranks of the crack 7th Regiment wheeled up Canal Street. They were the first elements of the state militia rushed from Gettysburg. 9 more New York regiments, as well as one from Michigan, arrived in the next 2 days. As soldiers swarmed the streets, the rioters adapted. They would attack African Americans, lone policemen, or anyone who looked well-to-do, and then vanish before help could arrive. They were learning their own version of guerrilla warfare. The last major confrontation took place in the rioters' stronghold on the east side. 5,000 desperate men attacked elements of the 7th Regiment on 2nd Avenue in what the Times labelled, quote, "the most sanguinary fight of the whole riot," end quote. Bullets and bricks from the rooftops killed 15 soldiers before another 700 troops arrived to clear the avenue with artillery and bayonet. By Friday, it was finally over. A battered, bruised and blackened New York emerged from 4 days of terror to count its dead, tend its wounded, and reckon with the scars the draft riots had left upon the city. The official death toll stood at just over 100, but many historians believe the true figure was far higher, with some estimates exceeding 2,000. Around $5 million worth of property had been destroyed. Few rioters were ever punished. The authorities appear to have feared provoking further unrest or creating martyrs. Only 81 rioters came to trial. 14 were acquitted, 67 convicted. Of those, 25 received sentences of 6 months or less. Talk about soft justice. The draft that provoked such fears turned out to be something of a damp squib. Across the whole of New York State, the draft only raised 2,300 troops for the Union Army. Though the authorities tried to move on and forget, the riots changed New York forever. The volunteer fire brigades that had done so much to provoke the riot were disbanded, replaced by the now famous New York Fire Brigade. The city police became far better organized and had proper riot training. But perhaps the biggest effect of the riots was on New York's African-American community. 25% of black New Yorkers have been left homeless, and many fled the city, never to return. In that sense, the rioters achieved one of their aims. New York would remain a far whiter city until the Great Migration decades later. Yet amid the horror and the smouldering ruins, there was hope. Many who remained left Lower Manhattan and built new lives in Harlem. It marked the beginning of the community that had become the cultural heart of Black America during the Harlem Renaissance. Even the Colored Orphan Asylum, reduced to ashes during the riots, would rise again there. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help the podcast grow, please follow the show, leave a review, or simply tell a friend. It really does make a difference. Next time on Forgotten Wars, we travel to ancient North Africa for Rome's most corrupt war. Numidia's king Jugurtha attempts to defeat the mighty Roman Republic through bribery and corruption, and for a while, he almost succeeds. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.